Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be doing a little bit of a health checkup on our beloved Wraithhosts. Since the balanced data slate, they've been in a little bit of a bad spot. We have seen some Wraith units appear in competitive play, but they haven't been quite as numerous as before. Especially with the various nerfs that our Wraith units have gotten. Both Wraithguard and of course the Wraith Knight took massive nerfs in prior balanced data slates. And arguably now, a lot of Wraith units are just not competitively priced for what they can do. So in this video, we're going to be talking about how we can rethink Aeldari Wraithhosts to make them effective again in semi-competitive and perhaps even competitive play. Because for all you guys out there who have Wraith armies, who love the Iyanden and who love the Wraithhosts and all that and the lore behind them, just like I do. I mean, personally, Biel-Tan is my favorite army, but my second favorite, of course, is Iyanden. So this video is for you guys because I want to see Wraith strong again for sure. And I've actually been playing around with a Wraith-based list during the last few weeks that kind of rethinks the way we play Wraith-based armies in 10th edition, especially after the balanced data slates. And to my surprise, it actually worked really well. And it got me thinking that maybe, just maybe, we're not giving Wraiths as much credit as we should. Alright, so let's go ahead and dive into what we're going to be discussing in today's video. We're first going to be talking about where Wraith units stand in the current meta. Then we're going to go over their strengths and weaknesses as an army. We're also going to be discussing some tips and tricks to playing a Wraith-based army. And lastly, I'm going to give you guys an example of a Wraith list that I've been playing since the January balanced data slate. So where do Wraith units stand in the current meta? Well, due to several nerfs, the only Wraith units seen consistently in competitive play are Wraith Blades with the axes and the shields to hold primary, and of course the Skaha Wraith Knight due to its immense damage and mobility. The Inferno Lances alone are a really potent tool against the Necron Menace, both against their vehicles and of course their Satan. All the other Wraith units are basically considered too expensive for the damage and survivability they produce, and the nerf to Fate's Messenger and Fate Dice hurt as well, especially Wraith Lords. I feel like Wraith Lords before the latest nerfs were kind of on the borderline of being really good, but unfortunately when the nerfs hit and the Fate Dice nerf kind of dug its heels in, Wraith Lords became just a little bit too unreliable and just not tough enough to withstand a lot of, highly competitive situations. And don't get me wrong, I still love Wraith Lords. I think they're solid. I just think maybe a little bit cheaper now since the Fate Dice nerf and since, they can't benefit from things like Fate's Messenger like they used to be able to. And of course, as for Wraithguard themselves, especially the Wraith Cannon variant, I just think that they are way too easy to counter in most cases. And, if you're fielding them in big blocks, there's tons of stuff nowadays that can basically just mow over them in combat. So they're definitely not as good as a control piece as they were before. And if I may real quick, I want to make a quick comparison that'll kind of show you guys why Wraithguard are now considered trash. It's not because they necessarily got nerfed hard in points, because, getting increased by 20 points per 5 overall is not the end of the world, right? And if that's all that changed and Fate's Messenger stayed relatively the same, I think they'd still be really good. What basically it was that killed them was the fact that they now have to shoot at the target that shot them with their ability. And this takes the level of control and presence they had on the battlefield out of your hands and into your opponent's hands, which was huge. And I actually tested it out a couple of times against my buddies. I had a list with 10 Wraithguard in it. I took it out for a spin. And yeah, it was very easy to play around. Let's just put it that way. And the Wraithguard didn't do nearly as much damage, especially without Fate's Messenger, as they were doing before. And not only that, but they were no longer dictating the battle as they used to. And just to give you guys a quick example from another game system, a lot of you guys might know a game called War Machine, and you guys might know about a certain competitive caster in Mark II that was basically considered one of the most OP casters in the entire game. And of course, I'm talking about Haley 2. And the reason why Haley 2 was so good is because she, once per game, instead of your opponent getting to select the order of activation of their units, you got to select the order of activation of their units. So basically, a really good player could put their opponent in a situation with Haley 2 in which they couldn't do anything that turn, right? It was a very powerful ability, and Wraithguard did something very similar. They prevented your opponent because of, the mixture of Overwatch, the mixture of being able to shoot back at whatever you wanted to, and of course, the fact that they were also very tough, meant that whatever moved within 18 inches was potentially going to die if your opponent wasn't careful. So they had to be very careful with their activations, and they couldn't do things in the wrong order, and oftentimes this would prevent a lot of damage. However, they don't have this anymore, unfortunately, so, Wraithguard, at least with the Wraith cannons, are just, kind of seemingly weak on the battlefield. A lot of points and not a lot of presence. So in general, we've seen a shift away from Wraiths, and as of lately, we've actually also seen a bit of a shift, not too much, but a bit of a shift away from Wraith Blades as well. The thing about Wraith Blades is they're very good at holding a primary objective, but that's all they do, right? They don't do a whole lot of damage, and if, your opponent just kind of leaves them there to hold the primary and goes after other stuff, it's a lot of points tied into one thing. There's also several units in the meta currently that can do a very good job at killing Wraith Blades. Black Templars, of course, have Helbrecht, and he's extremely strong against Wraithguard and Wraith Blades. Mostly Wraith Blades because he deals mortal wounds, and of course he's going to be with his Sword Brethren, who are very good as well. Having wounds 3 is very good against the Wraith Blades' damage to weapons. So there's just a lot of counters right now in the meta that, can take care of Wraith Blades relatively easily. And Wraith Blades don't have a lot of tricks up their sleeve, so there's not a lot of ways that they can really combat against those very strong combat units. All right, but meta aside, we all know that, no one's really running pure Wraith armies in competitive play, and they haven't done so really since the beginning of the edition when, devastating wounds were just absolutely overpowered and the Eldar were extremely overtuned with the possible combination of devastating wounds and fate dice and all that stuff. So as of now, what are their strengths and weaknesses as an army? So their strengths are they're extremely tough, and I don't think that really went away. I think they lost a little bit of their toughness, but for the most part, they're still a 2+ armor save, toughness 7, infantry unit, at least for the Wraith Blades and Wraith Guard. The Wraith Lords are a little less tough, but you have the Wraith Knights, which are still, toughness 12. They're very hard to deal with as well, especially when you back it up with things like Fortune. They're also armed with very powerful weapons that have great AP and damage. You're talking about AP -4 weapons a lot of times. That's insane. That takes out Terminators. That basically gives Marines no armor save. And it's very good against, targets in cover because of that great AP value. So these guys are packing some pretty powerful weapons. However, their weaknesses are they are relatively slow moving. They don't really benefit too well from things like Fire and Fade because they are a little bit slower. Wraith Lords only being movement 8, Wraith Guard and Wraith Blades only being movement 6. And especially since Phantasm got nerfed, their speed has been considerably reduced. They're also pretty expensive and they're vulnerable to anti-effects and mortal wounds. If you're running a big blob of Wraith Blades, for example, not only are they going to be a character unit, but they're also going to be a Psyker unit, and they're also going to be infantry. There's a lot of effects out there that can wound them on a 2+, and that basically means their toughness value counts for nothing. They're especially bad into matchups that deal a lot of mortal wounds as well. Thousand Sons can deal a bunch of mortal wounds, also ignoring armor with some of their Cabal rituals. Custodes are also really good into them because they have great combat, so they can just basically mow them down in close combat. And in general, in the current meta, there's just a lot of armies out there that are, packing the weapons necessary to deal with heavy infantry. If a weapon can deal with the Terminator, it can most likely also deal with the Wraith Guard. Or, for that matter, a Wraith Blade. So Wraiths definitely have an uphill battle in the competitive scene. I think in the casual scene, they're still very strong because people are building their armies differently. But in competitive play, when people are building their armies to actually kill Terminator equivalents and Marine equivalents quite easily, you're going to have a lot of issues if you don't know exactly what you're doing with them. So I don't want to give the impression, though, that I'm just kind of talking down on Wraiths and I'm saying that they can't be played competitively. I just think that we kind of need to rethink how we use them. And I want to give you guys and share with you guys a few tips and tricks to playing a Wraith-based army after the post-balance data slate. So my first tip to anybody out there who's playing a Wraith-based army is to move your army as one and don't spread out too much. Wraiths are vulnerable to getting isolated and picked off without support, and it's very tempting, because they're tough, to spread them out on primary and say, hey, well, no matter what you kill, you're going to have to, kind of give up some primary points. The problem with this is that once you go up against players who are a little bit more skilled, a little bit more competitive, they're able to isolate your units and pick them off one by one. So basically, you're not getting a lot of primary points because your, units of Wraiths are dying off. And second of all, you're not doing a lot of damage to the enemy. You're kind of just sitting there and soaking up fire. And at the end of the day, yeah, they are very tough to kill, but there are a lot of points. And if your opponent is able to kind of maneuver their army in any kind of way to concentrate their forces, then they're still going to be, basically removed. Any player that is good is going to be able to use force concentration to eliminate a squad of Wraiths basically per turn if they're not properly supported. So to prevent this from happening, pick a flank, attack it hard, secure that flank, and then move towards the center as one. Use your army's greater force concentration and toughness, as well as high damage, to deal a mortal blow to one of the enemy's flanks. And then, of course, after that happens, your opponent is going to have a much harder time isolating your units and picking them off one by one. And at the same time, make sure you're screening out your opponent's biggest combat threats with support units or Wraith Blades. Ideally, you want to do it with support units, things like Shroud Runners and Rangers, but in a pinch, if you are running a more fluffy Wraith army, you can do it with Wraith Blades, with axes and shields. They tend to be pretty good at surviving, and you can definitely use them for that if you need to. All right, so I want to share with you guys an example of a Wraith-based list that I've been playing post-January Balance Data Slate, and what I hope it does is give you guys kind of an example of how I've rethought running a Wraith army considering all the changes. And like I said at the beginning of this video, I was actually surprised how well this list did when I used force concentration to my advantage. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right into the list. So this is going to be a Wraithhost list. It came out to 1,995 points. Couldn't get that extra 5 points in, but that's okay. And just a quick kind of piece of advice for you guys out there, especially those of you with OCD who really need it to be 2,000 points exactly. It's way better to have a list be 5 points or even 10 points under than ruin the integrity of the list by, swapping out units until you get exactly 2,000 points. All right, so for our characters, we of course need to start off with the Autarch Wayleaper. It is going to be our CP generation. We're going to need a lot of CP for this list to keep it as mobile as possible. Even though it is a very slow Wraith-based list, we're going to implement a few things in this list to make it much faster and synergize much better together. The Autarch Wayleaper is actually pretty good on its own as well, just being able to shoot very well with the Dragon Fusion Gun in a pinch. It has a Howling Banshee mask, gives them strikes first, and the Starglaive is nothing to write off either. It's pretty good as well. So you can actually involve the Autarch Wayleaper in the battle more directly if you want to. We also have a Farseer in this list, which is really good for buffing up the toughness of any unit. Theoretically, Farseer could probably be swapped out for, another secondary score or something like that. But I really just felt like having the extra toughness in this list would make it a lot stronger. I have a lot of key pieces that are going to be pretty tough to bring down. We also have 2 Spirit Seers. They will be joining the units of Wraithguard that I have in this list. But there's a bit of a twist with those units that I will explain later. But basically, Spirit Seers are just kind of like almost an auto-include in a Wraith list. They really go with the theme, and also giving lethal hits as well as, +1 to hit to the unit is really useful. And on top of that, of course, they resurrect a model per turn, which is always good. It basically means if you're able to keep your unit alive, they get to kind of regenerate their points over the course of the game. We also have 2 Wave Serpents in this list. I wanted to make this list a lot faster than people expected, and my goal for it was to make it really tough, but also very fast and maneuverable. So I wanted to put 2 Wave Serpents in here to basically move my Wraithguard across the battlefield quickly. and also to give my units a little bit of extra threat range because, as you're going to see in a moment, they're going to need every single inch of it. They're armed with twin bright lances also, just because I just wanted a little bit more anti-large in this particular list at range, but I could easily have gone with shuriken cannons. I just felt like going with the bright lances for this particular list. Being able to use the Serpent Shield and possibly deny the enemy the chance to use defensive strats is also very good. And, dealing 4 mortal wounds worth the damage isn't bad either, especially if you're trying to kill a hard target. As for our other data sheets, we have 5 Rangers for screening purposes and infiltrating, so they can kind of get up the board, screen, infiltrate, move, block, what have you. This allows us to set up on the battlefield and to quickly take a flank if we need to and not get bogged down in our own deployment zone, which can happen very easily if your Wave Serpents get tied up in close combat. We also have 2 Shroud Runner units because Shroud Runners are just going to be our secondary scorers. They also have incredible synergy with the other units in our army. Giving out lethal hits, it may not seem like a big deal because, our Wraith Guard units are already going to have that with the Spirit Seers. But it does give us the ability to concentrate fire a lot better, and in this type of list, where we're going to be moving it all as one, supporting each other, that's going to be really important. You have to get as much damage as you can in as little time as possible so you can secure a flank and then push to the center. It also goes without saying that if we're going up against a combat build or something like that, these guys can screen very effectively and prevent enemies from getting into combat with our more fragile Wraith units. Because, Wraith Guard are pretty fragile in close combat when all is said and done. We also, of course, have the Skata Wraith Knight, and the Skata Wraith Knight has 2 Inferno Lances, 2 Star Cannons, and of course the Titanic Feet. Not being such a great combat unit, but this thing is really good at taking out tanks, and because it has Melta, it's really good at getting around damage, anti-modifiers essentially. So things like the Catan Shard that has, half all damage. Melta weapons are very effective at, kind of busting through that. And also, it's very mobile because it has the ability to basically, sky leap once per game, which can make it a very good model at baiting enemy units toward one side of the battlefield, and then during your first turn, deploying it to the other side of the battlefield where you can concentrate your forces. And as promised, we have 2 units of 5 Wraith Guard, but instead of the classic Wraith cannons, they're armed with D-Scythes. Proxy Hammer, why are you going with D-Scythes? They're obviously the inferior choice. Well, in a normal Eldar build, you would be correct. There'd be no point to D-Scythes because we have so many, options for anti-infantry weapons as is. You got fire dragons, you got so many other choices that can deal with, kind of Terminator equivalents and other heavy infantry. Not only are these guys really good at dealing with heavy infantry, but when you're using force concentration and you have the buff of lethal hits on your side, you can actually do some significant damage against large targets as well. Now, the thing about D-Scythes is they do not have devastating wounds, so there's no anti-synergy there. Lethal hits means an automatic wound at AP -4. Yes, it is damage 1, but that's still going to be very powerful in large amounts, and we do have 2 units of these. They're also a little bit better at Overwatch than your standard Wraith Guard and 5-man units. And they do automatically convert their 6s to hit on Overwatch into lethals because of the Spirit Seer. So, that's basically just, 3 AP -4 hits per unit. So not great, but not bad at stopping lone operatives and stuff like that. And I actually find that their ability is much better than on Wraith Guard because, people can bait Wraith Guard pretty easily now and just, kind of have them shoot at an infantry unit or something that's very trash. But because this unit actually has a shorter range, the targets that are going to be within range are usually going to be the targets that are going to be the most threatening. So if your opponent has a unit that wants to charge in, it's most likely going to be much closer and therefore an eligible target for the ability to go off. So you're not going to be, kind of wasting shots on, chaff infantry or something that's not that important, because if you're not in range to shoot that unit, then, you're not going to be able to use the ability on that unit, and you're going to have to, have the opportunity to use it on something better. And believe it or not, I've actually found that these guys are a little bit more effective at dealing with anything toughness 9 or below, even if they're vehicles, things like rhinos and chimeras and stuff like that, than Wraith cannons themselves. Wraith cannons, of course, are better against the tougher vehicles, but against anything with a 3+ armor save, toughness 9 or less, quite frankly, the D-Scythe is just as good, if not slightly better, than the Wraith Cannons. And I think that's due to a couple things. First of all, you have lethal hits, and you have a high volume of attacks. So when you mix those things together, on average, you're getting about 3 lethals. So against a toughness 9, toughness 8 transport, it's going to go straight through armor. So that's 3 automatic wounds right there. Then on top of that, every 3+ you roll to wound is basically going straight through armor. So you average about 9 wounds dealt to a transport, which in most cases will kill or almost kill that transport off. And if you're using Wraith Cannons, in my experience, it's a lot more swingy, especially if your opponent decides to pop smoke or, use any kind of defensive stratagems to help them survive. So that's basically been my experience with Wraith Cannons versus D-Scythes when it comes to transports, lower toughness vehicles. The D-Scythes actually kind of outperform them in some ways and are more reliable. And it's also nice that the D-Scythes, the lethal hits, at least from the Spirit Seer, don't interact poorly with a potential devastating wound of the Wraith Cannon, right? Because D-Scythes don't have that devastating wound profile. And again, I can't stress this enough with the D-Cannons. Their D6 damage means it's really swingy. It's a lot less reliable than the D-Scythes when you get all these shots, right? So D6 damage, you have 3 of them that are probably going to go through against a light transport. And that should be 10 damage on average. But you could easily roll less than that and do, basically nothing, right? Like I've rolled a 5 on 3d6 before, for example. And there's not really much you can do against that, except maybe you can command reroll one of them, but it's probably not worth it. And then you have a situation where you have, a full unit, 190-point unit, shooting at a probably 80-point transport and failing to kill it, which is kind of embarrassing. So, your D-Scythes, on average dice, will do 10 damage, and it's a lot more reliable, I feel, than the Wraith Cannons. And the upside to the D-Scythe, of course, is that it's much better against mech equivalents, your bog standard Space Marines, your 3+ armor save with no invul infantry. So this is a unit that, honestly, I tried in the beginning of the edition. I didn't really like it because the ability was much better on Wraithguard with Wraith Cannons back then, and I never really considered it on this unit because I felt like it was too easy to get around 12-inch range. But because these guys are coming out of Wave Serpents, because I'm, kind of keeping the army together, I'm keeping them well supported, the 12-inch range isn't actually that big of a deal because it's supported by units that have a much longer threat range. And, you do need some short-range stuff to be able to deal with, kind of potential enemy assault troops and so forth. And it's kind of funny because I actually had somebody in the channel Discord for a long time who was a really big proponent of D-Scythes. And everybody, including myself, thought that, D-Scythes were kind of the obvious worst option. But this just goes to show you that in some situations, in some builds, D-Scythes actually might be the better choice for your army. And that's definitely what it was this time around. So to that guy, the D-Scythe proponent, I can't remember your username, man, I'm sorry. But you're an absolute Chad, dude. And if you're watching this, thank you, because you actually inspired this in a way, believe it or not. All right, so closing out the list, we have 2 Wraith Lords. Now, I thought long and hard about including these actually because, my initial thoughts on Wraith Lords were, they don't really fit with the vibe of the army being very fast. Wraith Lords are kind of slow. I want a fast Wraith list. I considered doing another, Skata Wraith Knight, but I actually decided against it because I would have had to cut elsewhere, and I didn't want to make those cuts because I felt like it would really hurt my secondary game, and it would have, not having Shroud Runners in the list would have definitely done that. So I ended up going with the Wraith Lords because even though I figured they're not that fast, I do need something to kind of bring up the rear guard help screen the back of my army and prevent me from getting back capped, essentially, by units like Inceptors and other fast-moving, assault troops that can also score secondaries. And these guys are basically just here to protect the support units, the Autarch Wayleaper, and the Farseer. And that's basically it. They kind of dig themselves into the rear objective, the cover surrounding that objective to screen enemy units out. And then if enemy units do come in, like they come within 3 inches or something, I have an easy kind of option to essentially just overwatch, right? If I'm next to a Farseer, I can change a, bad fate dice to a 6, and I can kill an Inceptor on arrival. Maybe if I'm lucky enough, even 2. I've had, some games where this actually worked and I actually got 2 6s. I rolled a 6 and then I, fate diced the other one to be a 6, which was really cool. And killed 2 of them, which can happen. So even if you only kill 1 Inceptor though, 1 model in a deep striking unit, that changes the math considerably in your favor to be able to survive. So if Inceptors are going after a Farseer, for example, or Inceptors are going after, your Autarch Wayleaper, on average rolls, you should be able to pass. And you should be able to survive if you're able to kill one of those off. Which is absolutely huge, right? Because basically your models aren't dead until they're dead. They can still do pretty much everything until they have lost their last wound. So your Autarch Wayleaper can continue to generate command points. Your Farseer can continue to, use fortune and stuff like that. And, I felt like this was a worthy investment to include a pair of these in the army. The other thing these guys do is they add a little bit of combat support. They're actually not bad in combat. They have pretty good damage, strength 10 weapons. I believe they're AP -3 as well. So they do pretty good at, killing Marine equivalents and, even Terminator equivalents with the Ghostglaive. These Wraith Lords do have Bright Lances because I wanted them to be in a more defensive role, so they could maybe, fire off an Overwatch with a Bright Lance, or they could kind of heroically intervene if they needed to, right, in the backfield to protect the Farseer or the Autarch Wayleaper. So that was their goal. They actually did really well in this. And the cool thing about Wraith Lords is a lot of people don't realize this, but they actually do have assault weapons. So in a pinch, they can score secondaries for you. Doesn't come up that often, but if you have like an investigate signals or something like that and you're taking a flank, you can at least, move the Wraith Lord up, maybe, move some Shroud Runners to the corners, and you can actually score, pretty decent points on investigate signals. Not as well as a typical Eldar army, obviously, with a lot of swooping hawks and warp spiders and stuff, but, good for an army like this. Where normally, most kind of Wraith-based lists are kind of bad at investigate signals unless you're really just wailing on your opponent. The last thing about the Wraith Lord, and kind of a hidden bonus, is that they do generate fate dice. So not a lot of people think about it because it doesn't come up super often. But, a couple of Wraith Lords in your backfield, if your opponent is playing a more competitive style list, they will have threats that can deep strike into your backfield, score objectives, and so forth. And the Wraith Lords can pick up those units fairly easily and convert them into fate dice. Which, of course, can continue to feed your Wraith Lords, 6s on Overwatch. They can help protect your, Wraith Knight. They can help you deal more damage with your Bright Lances and so forth. So it is useful to have fate dice. I know fate dice got nerfed a lot in the last balanced data slate, but, having a couple Wraith Lords in a list like this is a pretty good deal because, typically you're going to generate a couple more fate dice per game than usual. Okay, so what were my final thoughts on the list and possible improvements? So the list worked a lot better than I initially expected, especially when the units were able to support each other. I basically always moved them together. I made sure that, they were in range to support each other if, my opponent dropped something down on them or, kind of something like that. If my opponent was able to get past the screening Shroud Runners and Wave Serpents into the Wraith Guard themselves, I was often able to capitalize and punish whichever unit charged in, even if it was a elite combat unit. So I did play a game against my Dark Angels buddy, and he had a unit of, Deathwing Terminators assault into a unit of Wraith Guard at one point in the battle. And he did kill them, obviously, because Wraithguard are not good in combat, especially against Terminators. But because all my units were in range to support each other, those Terminators actually didn't do anything else in the game. They were promptly destroyed after that. Now, having said that, the list worked well, but it's still a little bit low on secondary specialists, and I would perhaps consider a few Swooping Hawks instead of a Wraithlord. I think the Wraithlords obviously did okay, but I probably, if I wanted to trim some fat off, I only need one of those to kind of support my Wayleaper and my Farseer. I think having two of them was like kind of cool, but I felt like one of them was kind of doing nothing most of the time. And my opponent was typically just not worried about them. They didn't really have a huge impact offensively. They were more of a defensive style unit. So my opponent was more, worried about dealing with the Wraith Knight and the Wraith Guard than the Wraithlord in the backfield. So if I cut one of those, I could probably afford a few Swooping Hawk units, and that would boost my secondaries quite a bit. Now, I know this isn't, this is kind of coming to the realm of, is this really a Wraith host anymore? But, it's still Wraith-based. You still have most of your army being Wraithguard and, Wraith units and units that support Wraiths. So I think that's fine, I think, obviously, if you're going for a pure Wraith list, you wouldn't even have Shroud Runners in it. You would just have pure Wraiths, Maybe instead of the Shroud Runners, you have another unit of Wraith Blades or, something like that in Strategic Reserve, trying to rapid ingress in there. You probably have more Wraith Guard instead of the Wave Serpents, maybe even, You just kind of run as many Wraiths as possible. But we weren't kind of going for that. We're going for more of a fast, more modern Wraith list. So, I probably, to kind of optimize this list a little more, probably would drop one of the Wraithlords for Swooping Hawks. Or, alternatively, I could drop a Wraithlord for a Wraithseer, which could kind of play more in the midfield. Okay, so in conclusion, again, I was surprised that the list performed better than it looked on paper, and the D-Scythes out of a Wave Serpent were surprisingly effective at mulching tough infantry, and really, I guarantee you guys, if you guys are running Wraith lists, give them a shot. Give D-Scythes out of a Wave Serpent a shot. You do need the Spirit Seer with them, right? You do need to invest in that, but they deal a ton of damage, and it's a surprising amount of damage against vehicles as well. Definitely don't let the damage one fool you. They are strength 10, they are AP -4, and they do have D6 attacks apiece. So even though Wraith-based lists might not be super competitive, I'm starting to think that with some adjustments, they can be a lot more viable in the competitive sphere and definitely have a ton of potential for success at the semi-competitive level. If you're playing with your buddies and your buddies are competitive, they're playing kind of more competitive units built around winning and not so much built around just, fluff and having, fun with units that look cool, then I think Wraith armies like this actually have a lot of bite to them and are surprisingly effective. And if your opponent doesn't have the correct tools to deal with the Wraith units, then they're going to be in a lot of trouble. Especially if you keep your army together as one, your opponent is going to have very little opportunity to make good trades against you. And then over the course of the game, you can slowly grind your opponent down as you take the flank and then push to the center and absolutely destroy your opponent's hopes and dreams. And of course, send your opponent's forces deep into the warp. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. Let me know what your guys' Wraith builds are. If you want to go ahead and leave a comment or a list in the comments section about what you're running, if you're running a Wraith list, please go ahead and drop that list in the comment section. Or if you've had any kind of strategies or tactics that you've been using with Wraith units, go ahead and leave those in the comment section as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. And once again, I do want to thank my Patrons and supporters for helping support the channel over the last year and a half. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly. If you do want to help support the channel, I have free trials activated on my Patreon, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description below. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, or you want to grab some Eldar inspired apparel on the channel store page. I will leave those links in the description as well. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching once again, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.